Semester number 2, lesson number 19. Our aim today is how did the Great Depression drastically affect the lifestyle of many Americans? And we're going to see how the Great Depression really affected everyday life in America. The first thing I want you guys to do, and we're going to do this together in class, is we're going to read and annotate No Men Wanted by Carl Monroe. And I want you to keep a few talking points in mind. Do you think the title is fitting? And explain why. How did some people take advantage of others during this time? And after reading this, does this situation seem more or less dire than you perceived? Explain. So really what I'm asking there is, does this situation seem as bad as you thought it was, or less worse than you thought it was? And today we're going to talk about the Dust Bowl, the people, and the psychological effects of the Great Depression. And the first thing we're going to look at are the rural areas, the farmland, the places outside the city. Overproduction of goods dropped the prices of things, of these crops, and a loss of land led to foreclosure. All right. Basically, farmland they were overproducing their crops, and they just weren't getting enough people to buy them. If you produce too much, the value of that thing is going to go down, and people aren't going to buy as much. And really, with crops, there's only so much you can sell. The Dust Bowl did not help out either. Between 1930 and 1940, the southwestern Great Plains suffered a drought, one of the worst droughts in its history. All right, dry land began to blow away across the plains. Clouds of dust engulfed the region, and families abandoned their homes and land. If we look on the right here, this was land that at one point was fertile land that things were being grown on, that cows were grazing on, and all that. However, the problem was they farmed this land into basic uselessness. They over-farmed it. They did not give it time to replace its nutrients. They didn't take a season off. They continued to farm on it until really all the nutrients in it just died out, and it just became basically, dust, like sand. And when the winds picked up in the 1930s and 40s, and there was this interesting weather pattern, you had all these dust storms that really were awful throughout the southwestern Great Plains, and it was getting in people's lungs and it was killing them. Not to mention, obviously, there was no production of goods at this time. It didn't help that at the same time they're battling the Great Depression because of economic situations. So a few talking points to keep in mind. During the Great Depression, everyone struggled. We know that. Do you think farmers experienced the worst situation during the Great Depression? Explain. Do you think those farmers who quote-unquote toughed it out and stayed on the Great Plains portrayed the true American spirit? So just think about what it means, this true American spirit. And did these farmers who stayed, did they show their grit and determination? Men, women, and children. So on the right here you have some interesting pictures I want you to look at. Thousands of men traveled the country by train. They were called hobos. They literally went from city to city on the train looking for jobs, and almost 95% of the time there was no work to be had. All right, women worked to help support the family. Sadly, women's pay was lower at this time, as you guys probably could understand. Children had poor diets, which caused health problems. All right, they had all types of things, calcium deficiency, scurvy, because they were not getting the nutrients that they need from food, because they really weren't getting enough food. And schools closed. Education was not very prevalent at this time. There were not a lot of schools. Only the extremely wealthy were going to schools, because all of the younger children, sadly, a lot of them needed to do some work or whatnot to try to make some extra money for the family. And even if the kids were not per se working, parents couldn't afford to give them clothing to go to school. So it was really a tough time period. And you could imagine that as bad as it was for whites, all right, it was much, much worse for Africans and Latinos in America. They faced discrimination and racial violence. Their unemployment rate was even higher, about 50% to the standard 25 to 27%. Very low pay. African Americans were getting lynched by the KKK, and Mexicans were deported in the 1930s because they didn't want them to take the jobs of quote-unquote real Americans. So, as bad as it was to be a white person during the Great Depression, it was even worse for African Americans and Latino Americans. So what were the psychological effects? Because we talked about this for a little bit in the other 2 days, but for men especially who were always seen as the breadwinners, the providers for their family, you know, they felt as though they had failed in their job and they were letting down their entire families. And overnight, these people lost their entire, fortune, whatever money they had in the stock crash and in the banks. And people lost the will to survive. They really did. They lost their money and their families, who relied on them now, they could not supply food for or shelter and whatnot. And a lot of men just couldn't deal with this. Suicide rate went up to more than 30% during the Great Depression. And for most men, it wasn't that they didn't want to work; it's that there was literally no jobs for them. And if you look at this picture on the right, this guy was saying he didn't want charity; he wanted a job. All right. So just some more talking points. I'm sorry. Why were suicide rates so high? Was the government at fault? All right. Uh, I want you to recall to the poem we read, or we're going to read, Pantheon of the Great Depression, as well as No Men Wanted. After reading about people losing the will to live, do you still believe the poem defined the majority of people during the Great Depression? Explain, and we're going to talk more about that in class. Our check for understanding today is, what was the overall effect of the Dust Bowl during the 1920s and 1930s? A. Farmers profited across the Midwest. B. Farmers left their homes in search of a job in the cities. C. The government provided farmers with money to make up for lost profits. Or D. Farmers began growing different growing different crops. And we will talk more about that tomorrow. Your classwork. You are choosing two of the three on a separate sheet of paper. Why does it seem that farmers had it especially bad during the Great Depression? Explain. Which group, men, women, children, African Americans, or Latinos, do you believe had the most difficult life during the Great Depression? And explain that as well. And why were so many people psychologically defeated during this time? How had the Great Depression changed the American lifestyle? And I want you to connect back to what we learned about the Roaring Twenties. I don't think that there has ever been a situation in history where two back-to-back decades were so different. The 1920s was so outgoing and free, and the 1930s was just a constant struggle. It's really amazing that, these decades were back-to-back. And for our exit slip today, we're going to create a thesis statement using the AIM as a prompt. How did the Great Depression drastically change the lifestyles of many Americans? Have a good night.